Welcome to Landmark Talks Property, a podcast by Landmark Information Group that covers all things property in short and intelligent podcasts.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Landmark Talks Property. I'm joined today by my colleague Ben Robinson of Landmark Estate Agency Services. Hi Ben.
Hello.
And we're here today to talk about the latest government announces around the home buying reform process. There's been an awful lot come out recently from the government, so this is an opportunity to talk through it, get an idea of what it means to the market, what it means for consumers, what it means for professionals within the market, and what the next few years might look to as we build into some of those changes. So I think first up, let's talk about from a high level about the announcements within the government's consultation. So there's been a few key points come out, which I'll just quickly run through. The main ones being the mandatory upfront property information to be supplied with listings, digital reusable property data, greater commitment to be provided early on in the sales process, higher professional standards, and a more connected digital process. Ben, if I can bring you in at this point, we've been expecting this announcement for a while, and now it's arrived.
Yeah.
It feels like it's an important step towards modernising the home buying process. How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I think it's a welcome step. I think the market's been moving this way as it is. Transactions are lengthening unbelievably, despite introduction of lots of technology, and getting less certain, and that's been even more so in the last couple of years. That's putting financial pressure on all businesses. I think within the industry, this improvement is not a zero-sum game. If we lift the market, everybody within the market will be better off, but the market's fragmented. There's thousands of professionals of all different types, of all different sizes, using lots of different software. That makes change difficult. So I really welcome that the government are going to help take a lead on it, and have listened actually, because it does follow, as you said, the consultation with the market, and we've been given some much needed guidance. Not even just for the professions that are seeing 120-day plus for transactions to go through. In the government's own numbers, there's a sort of 1.5 billion impact to the wider economy and 400 million impact to home movers. So when we look at the economy itself, it's taking a real hit, and people, because of the stress that's involved in the transaction process. So again, it's got to be welcome that the government are going to encourage this moving forwards. And I guess now it's just about trying to work through from their side and ours what that detail looks like. The latest is we've got some guidance over that it's going to be over the period of parliamentary term. That's, I think, probably about 3 years left. And I think when you look at that, it's when do those things happen is going to be important, when ultimately looking at the impact and how we respond to it as a market. But I guess the headline there is guidance now, no immediate change. So don't panic. Everybody was moving this way anyway, so let's just work together to accelerate that and do it properly, which also, I guess, avoids the idea that this might be done to the industry rather than with the industry, which I feel it is some thought process from what's happened in the past.
Yeah, completely agree. I think there's the economic impacts is pretty clear. There's some really big numbers there. Ultimately, if we can improve certainty and get people moving, make it easier for people to move, then more people will do it, and we can we know the downstream impact that will have on the wider economy, on furniture sales, on paint sales, all of those kind of things that people spend money on when they move house, as on top of just the additional economic impact on the house buying process and the house buying industry.
Absolutely.
So if we talk through a couple of the key points one by one, I think the first one is that first big shift is that movement to upfront information. There's some interesting stats come out of the consultation that the government have published, which is 79% of responses to the consultation agreed there should be mandatory requirement for comprehensive upfront information. 58% of respondents agreed that upfront information should include property searches and a property condition report. And finally, 27% of respondents suggested introducing new legislation was the best way for government to support the industry's capacity to implement these changes. So those first two stats kind of fairly overwhelming support for upfront information in the process. Ben, what's kind of view on the let's call them sales packs and how that might work?
Yeah, I think, again, perhaps we've seen similar before, but it makes sense. It makes sense to have the information at the start. It's about getting listings on properly rather than quickly. And I think most agents now, embrace that to an extent. If you look at even marketing material, perhaps in the past wasn't always the best, but now it's made sure it's done properly rather than quickly. You don't see, many of the right move alerts that nowadays coming out with a waiting picture, for example, because they get it. You've got to do that right. And yes, that means perhaps slowing down initially to list, but only a little bit. But it means getting that on properly, and that means everyone's got the right answers when they need them. So that is the biggest thing. And I think when you look at, which is referenced actually in the government's announcements, when you look at other markets where this happens, you cannot argue transactions then go through more seamlessly, more quickly and with more certainty. Even on our doorstep in Scotland, it happens. And actually, I would say even in England and Wales, when you look at auctions, perhaps, yes, there's often different type of buyer, but ultimately they're able to do that quickly because everybody's involved in the start with the right information. It's published up front. These things don't need to take time to find out if you just get it right, once well and share it. So I think you can see the overwhelming support because people get it. I think what's been missing is the guidance of what that looks like. Material information was a suggestion, but the problem with suggestions or woolly guidance is everybody interprets it slightly differently. So I do think then getting down to the legislation, doing it right with the industry gives clear guidance as this isn't an optional. It's not do a bit of this and a bit of that. It's not lost in the wilderness. It's not this is what we do.
Yeah, it's interesting to reference material information because I think that one of the points that certainly Landmark have made during the consultation, and I know many others have in the process, is the importance of the provenance and, I guess, trustability of data. And I think one of the concerns about material information was that where it wasn't known necessarily where that information had come from, or it was from a maybe uninsured source or unsupported source, then it couldn't be used down the line by those professionals who are liable if anything goes wrong with the transaction, like lawyers or lenders. So I think legislation helps ensure that the data used is the right type of data, so it can be trusted by others in the process.
Yeah. And I think when you look at it, obviously we mentioned sales packs to get away from the comparison, perhaps, to HIPs, home information packs, which people will look back at in political hot today on perhaps today. Why are we going through that again? But I'll be honest, I was there when that happened, and there were weaknesses to the home information pack without a doubt. But for me, it just needed changing from the learning so far to remove those weaknesses and bring in new strengths. It didn't need it removing entirely. And actually, there's lots of people in the industry who, by the end of home information packs, we got used to using them and found it beneficial. There weren't many agents I've spoke to who went through that who didn't say that saved one or two sales because we knew up front what we would have found out later and had to negotiate on. So I think that will be, it's easy to get carried away with a word, or a phrase. And actually, this time it looks like we're taking the learning. They are talking to the industry, whereas again, home information packs in some ways were done to the industry, and that was part of the problem. You take the learning from that and say, well, what are the missing bits that were important that everyone uses elsewhere? And also that data provenance, shall we say, how do we make that interoperable and exchangeable, which is the suggestions downstream? And how do we work with the industry to do that? Because if I look at the criticisms, it was actually some of it was the data wasn't good enough or wasn't trusted downstream or wasn't easy to use downstream. So it was done again. So then you got repetition, but I think those were all easily solvable. And of course, they removed the condition report element and made it optional. I don't know what's going to happen here, but it looks like there is some commitment to actually having that. And obviously in Scotland, that does happen. And it does get a lot of benefit. But again, it's got to be done right with the industry, listen to the industry. And so don't just broad brush, which seems to be happening. So I think it's very different home information packs in the approach. And actually home information packs at the core did some good. So, Holden, the sale pack looks good to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, it ties on to the next major topic theme, which is around the digitization and digital property data and connected transactions. So, the emphasis here being the idea of interoperability, sharing, securely sharing data between participants in the transaction. And you touched on it before with HIPS. Some of the issue there was the duplication, where data and insight wasn't necessarily trusted by others in the process, and that causes delays, confusion, wasted cost. I think from my point of view, obviously Landmark as a data business, we've got a view on this, and from my experience in the lending and surveying industry, provenance of data is absolutely vital, and sharing data that can be trusted is key to making the process go quickly. If you look at lenders are using more and more data already within their decision-making processes, be that on how they value a property, either AVM or physical inspection, or their underwriting processes, their lending decisions. So having secure, trusted data that can be shared from early on in the transaction will reduce an awful lot of duplication and wasted effort. The example that I often give is, at the moment, a broker will apply to put a mortgage application into a lender based broadly on the consumer details, credit rating, income, etc. But not much property insight at that point, because the insight into the property condition only happens when a lender sends a valuer to go and inspect the property to understand the value and whether there's anything that lender wouldn't lend on that property based on the attributes. And so we'll get failed applications because we only find out that it's not suitable for lending for that particular lender after the application's gone in and a whole load of processing has taken place. A condition report means that decision can be known up front, because we know what the condition of the property is. We know, for example, whether it needs refurbishment, and therefore only this subset of lenders will lend on a property that isn't immediately inhabitable. We can make those decisions early and save wasted effort. That's one example of how digital shared data can reduce the transaction times, reduce delays. Ben, I'm sure there's a whole load of others that you can think of from an estate agency point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously, a lot of agents already run a title, for example, and that's a really important document to everybody to understand good title and a lot of the details around the property. If it's already there, why aren't people getting access to it? Obviously, AML comes up a lot as well, the anti-money laundering evidence. Yes, everybody has to run their own due diligence, but there's a difference between due diligence and the evidence. Evidence is part of your due diligence, and of course that evidence is often very similar. It's the same stuff that's asked for by 4 people or 5 people, 4 different ways, for example, and that frustrates the consumer, but also it adds cost and waste. Yes, we've got to tick boxes, the important boxes, to make sure that money isn't being laundered, but it's probably better done where that evidence is consistent and being reviewed actually by different people who might see something that wasn't there originally. So actually, I think things like that, collect it once well, make sure it's secure, as you say, interoperable. Difficult for me to say that one, but it is key. And I think the technology we've got now makes that much easier than it's ever been. Digital is the way, and data is really just answers. So here is some insight and answers that you need to make a decision, and then you make a decision. You might then add more evidence to that. Fair enough, but ultimately you might as well use what's already there, as long as it can be trusted. So that interoperability is huge, and I think if they get that right, it gets over a key criticism of home information packs, which was very much like, well, I do that bit and I don't trust you, or I don't trust that data, which is fair enough. It's got to be trusted. If you're going to put your name to it and say, well, I could be sued if I get it wrong, of course you're going to want it to be trusted. There's nothing wrong with that. So we got a chance to get it right.
Yeah, 100%. Moving on to our next topic point, which is around, it's an area very close to your heart, Ben.
Yeah.
You mentioned being around in the HIPS era, and although it might not feel it and look it, that means you've been in the industry for a long time. What does it mean? What does all this mean specifically as for an estate agent?
Well, I think it's, if you look at this change, the biggest change and potential burden, then it's moved to estate agency. And estate agents, they are commercial, immensely hardworking, but they often come into the industry with very little qualification or sometimes understanding of how the process works. So this is a big jump to say, okay, you collect it all. And that can see, well, I'm busy enough. I'm trying to get into the property. I'm trying to get it on the market. I'm trying to get it sold. That's my job. But actually, with modern technology and tools and using the right coordinated parts of those, it's easy to remove the burden and make it seamless. And there'll be lots of people out there, I'm sure, going to try and help agents do that. But if they embrace it and to slow down again the process of someone wants to come on the market, I want to get it on right, these are the tools of which I use it, the benefits are huge, not only for their home movers, who are then going to have much better experience, but for them. Because ultimately, it's less time chasing information. It's less time chasing sales that potentially could fall through or dealing with fall throughs because something came up at a later date. It's less wasted time downstream. In fact, a lot less. I'd say a massive burden of agents at the moment is doing that, which doesn't make them money. It just takes them time and increases the stress level. So if they do this right and embrace it and work with the right partners, then ultimately that pipeline is going to increase certainty dramatically. So that you might even get, especially if you look at, say, Project 28 type timelines, a 28-day exchange, for example. I know there's talk about here about early signing of sort of agreements so that it doesn't fall through. But actually, you can get exchange out of 28 days. There are no milestones. There are no chasing around. It does happen. So what do? You go back to growing your market share, being there for the customer. I mentioned zero-sum games earlier as well. If it's easier to move, more people will do it. There were so much more transactions before the last crash, actually, and during the home information pack era. So actually, that's more for everybody to share from. And then you go back to competing in a better way because you're not spending half your time trying to comply with different bits in different ways and chase transactions down. So there's obviously two sides to the coin. It's not going to be easy, but I think, again, if we're doing it with the government and with industry over time, people can get ready. Those best agents will embrace it, do it well, and make their lives easier. More money for less effort. Who doesn't want that at the end of the day? Even though it might feel like, well, this is a big change, I'm sure they can move seamlessly with it. They're adaptable. That's why they've proven usually, because they've started their own business and developed from there. So I'm sure it will be embraced, and they'll see the improvements pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I think a couple of key points are one that this is talk of a roadmap to change. It's not a light switch. It's going to go on overnight, and they'll come in after a weekend and have to completely change the way they work on a Monday morning. And I think the other thing is that whilst it might feel like more work to do as an agent, more burden for an agent, I think you nailed it. There's a whole load of work that agents do, which is really as a result of the broken process. And if we fix the process, then that time can be spent more effectively as an agent and ultimately for greater results. If all this happens, which I'm confident it will do, and has the impact that it will do, then it will just mean, I guess, a shift in what agents do to higher value stuff, supporting their customers more, as opposed to dealing with the inefficiencies of the current process, which is frustrating and not much fun, I suspect.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. There's nothing more frustrating than sales worked hard on that fall through for reasons that could have been caught out, or you're negotiating for months and months for something to fall through and everyone's feeling that pain. I think now as well, we've got the digital tools that we've not had in the past to make a lot of this seamless, this movement seamless, the transactional data, obviously AI in and around that, and how can that help support with insight and information.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think AI is a point I noticed somewhere in the finer print. There's a point around a result of this will be clarity on where AI can be used effectively within the process. So I think it's impossible to have any kind of conversation nowadays without AI, but we've lasted almost 19 minutes before it being mentioned, which is pretty good, I think.
I agree, and I think everyone who has worked with AI is sort of assisted maybe intelligence rather than artificial intelligence. It is an assistant, and it works really well if the data's in the right order, and so is the process. And so you start by fixing the process, and this data is in the right place. You've got rid of the inefficient parts, and then you digitize where you can. And that's why I think this is a really good way of doing it, because you fix the broken process first. You're not sort of trying to soothe symptoms. You're going for the disease, and then technology can make the right things easier, as opposed to digitizing steps that shouldn't even exist. They exist because the process is broken. So, yeah, I think layering on AI on top of this makes it powerful. If you try and do it today, it's just trying to minimize those symptoms.
Yeah, love that analogy. So moving on from agents, obviously the impact will be on more, everybody and different professionals in the process. Conveyancers around earlier involvement, being instructed early on, see, hopefully working on the case on the sell side before a buyer comes along. I mentioned impact for lenders of, I guess, better data being provided with an application or available at point of application. So there's impacts to everybody. What about conveyancers? What kind of challenges can you see there in the transition for them?
I think when I say the burdens coming to agents will still be listing the property. I think for conveyancers, it could be quite a big shift. And this is part of the challenge. We've got a fragmented industry, people with technology that works in the way that the system works today. And, ultimately lots of commercial models around that. So we shouldn't shy away from that. There's a challenge there to adaptation. But at the same time, conveyancers often unfairly get the blame when things go wrong. It's too slow. Where's this come up now? It's because they didn't have the answers. They didn't have the information they needed. And I would say if they're getting accurate information from the start and instructed early, so they've got some time before the buyer comes in to do it right. Let's be fair. They're the ones taking legal responsibility for a fair transaction for the home mover. Nobody else is doing that. They are. So they need the time to get it right. So actually, I think that's a massive benefit to them. And I think everybody will then see that blame was wrong, that the system was broken, not the conveyancer, that they've got the opportunity to help out early and innovate early with the agent, and not waste their time. Because generally everybody in this industry gets paid when things go right, or at least get paid more when things go right. So everyone has a vested interest in getting it through quickly and efficiently. And I think if conveyancers can have the right information from the start, questions or answers, far fewer inquiries. We know it's the inquiries process that's dragging the biggest delay because lack of information, poor information adds to questions. That's burdensome to them. They're chased as well, just like agents are chasing, and they're chasing. That wastes time that they could be using for getting on with conveyancing. That goes away. So actually, it probably makes their life, like everybody else, is a lot less stressful. Gives them time back to focus on what they're good at and qualified to do, and will really show that when we work together in the right order, that there was no one sat there saying, I'm going to try and make this transaction fall through. I'm going to try and take a long time, So I think a shift, but a real exciting one, I think.
Yeah, it's a really good point around, the time and impact of the process. I think we did some research a couple of years ago, which was 44%, I think, is the start of a conveyancer's time was being chased or chasing. You think you remove that out of a day, you've got a whole load more time to actually be doing the legal part. And we know from some of the Project 28 conversations that conveyancers got the vast majority of their actual work done after hours because the phone wasn't ringing in anymore, and they could crack on and do the bit that they need to concentrate on and get their head down and assess all the complexities of the transaction to support their customers.
Absolutely.
So moving on, I guess, to the important bit, which is the when, the timelines. And I guess the main talking points here are that the government has announced some timelines with this whole announcement, which start with the fact that later in this year there'll be consultation around the code of practice for estate agents, which I guess on a broader point is one thing to talk about. What might that mean for agents? Then from next year, consultation on qualifications and digital tools, and then in the longer term, legislation for sales packs and digital systems. And as you mentioned, the plan being for all of this to come into place before the end of the parliamentary term, which is 3 years away. Ben, what do you think around the code of practice element for estate agents, as a general thing, and then the timescales around that?
So I think most agents that I speak to anyway are broadly supportive, and I think the best agents will be because they already know the stuff, they're experienced, and they do the right thing. I think it's got to be done right, again, with the industry. You can't just suddenly say, right, from January, everyone needs a qualification, because it takes time to get qualified. They've got to understand, what does that mean for agents that maybe been in it 20, 30 years, that already have a lot of experience? What do they have to prove compared to someone coming in? But it's a better thing. I mean, this is a key part of the economy. Moving home's the biggest thing that you do. And the fact is, and I don't think it's right, in my opinion, is, I could jump from my job today and open an agency tomorrow, whereas a conveyancer has to go through years of qualification. So does a surveyor on the back end to be able to make those legally binding decisions. But agents are the ones that value it up front. They're the ones that are getting it ready for sale. They should have minimum standards. It also creates a form of barrier to entry. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you're willing to put it in and have the best people and deliver right, you will get good value for your service. If there's no barrier to entry at all, it can be often commoditized, but unfairly, because we do then get some bad practices from time to time, whether it be overvaluing, over promising, under delivering, and or taking shortcuts where others aren't, and then that's false commercial advantage, and also it stalls the market. I think you've seen quite a bit of that at the moment. Yes, there's uncertainty, but we've got a lot of stock on. There's been a huge amount of price reductions in the last 18 months. I think having some minimum standards is a good thing, because it's a massively important part of the industry and the economy, and also, let's be fair, unfairly so, because the majority of agents, like in any industry, are brilliant, hardworking, and want the best for their customers. And I think, having a qualification will maybe raise the opinion of agents in the public's mindset, because there are sometimes shown that they can be rather poorly seen upon, and that's again unfair and false reputations, but it's because of the odd bad actor that does something that they shouldn't. So we have a lot of legislation about how to bring on money laundering, material information, all this kind of stuff. Why wouldn't you want a bit of a better standard coming into there? And I'm sure, as I say, every agent I know that is who are doing the right things anyway are like, yeah, that's absolutely a good idea, done right. And I always come back to that. You don't want this sort of darkroom decisions with qualifications fired across the wall that everyone looks at and like, what, by January? And actually, that's not very useful. It's got to be useful. It's got to fit.
Yeah, and I think that the implementation of the code of practice, just like all of this, I think that the key thing is the aspect of a phased approach and the aspect of consultation with the market, because right now there's probably a few questions that lots of people are asking. Done right, a code of practice is absolutely right, but what's going to be in it? What does it look like? I want to see the detail before I can decide whether I think it's done right or not. And I think that the fact that there'll be engagement with the market throughout this whole process is a very good thing, and will have positive impacts. I think, thinking of the surveyor side of things, and we know this from Project 28 conversations as well, that one of the kind of slight concerns about having the condition report as an element of the Project 28 charter points was that around capacity of surveyors in the market. Do we have enough surveyors? We would. My opinion is, again, it depends how the condition report is implemented and how timely it will be. Whether it's a physical inspection or something that's done virtually through review of 3D walkthroughs or whatever, but on the assumption that it's similar to Scotland, which is a physical inspection, we'd need more surveyors trained up and more capacity within the market, which needs a lead time, and that's no bad thing. But I think if we're talking to the people who are running any of the surveying firms, you want some level of assurance that this is going to come in before you invest in training up and a whole new suite of surveyors. So yeah.
Absolutely agree. I think we're talking about asking agents and the other professionals to work at the start to get the property on right, and that takes a little bit longer than perhaps to list it. Well, this is exactly the same process. Let's do this right together, because everybody knows done right, it'll work. Right now, everybody's like, big announcement, and everyone wants the detail, but your rush to detail or your rush to the exacts will cause the problems that we're talking about there. I think we need to take the time to do it properly, do it in a phased manner. And I think that's then going to be to the long-term benefit of everybody, even if there's some impatience. And I think, from that view, you can look and say, well, don't always wait for legislation either. The good thing about a roadmap is if you are forward thinking and you are proactive, which some agents and other professionals are already doing today. Project 28, we know there are members there that are reporting back huge gains from changing what they did, even in a small way, quite a small way. And I think, start looking now, start looking and start doing things that get you ready for the bigger change, because you can lead in your market, you can win listings, increase speed and certainty off the back of it. If you're an agent, I don't know, I'm biased to agents, but I work in that space. And then when it changes, you're ready anyway. you were ready anyway. But as I say, there's certain parts that will take capacity and effort and time. Qualifications, again, you can't do them overnight. If they're going to be right, you've got to set a time frame.
Yeah, completely agree. And I completely agree about the, those, we know people are seeing positive impacts of part of this, these proposed processes already and have been doing for quite some time. So there is absolutely nothing to stop people working towards this and implementing components of a new process straight away. And we know from what we see with others that are doing it that reaps rewards. So just on one last point before we sign off, I think from a Landmark perspective, we have been involved in this process. We've been supporting government through part of the consultation, through supplying data that we see across our businesses on milestones, on the issues that we see from the current process. Understanding that is a key component to then understanding what we can do to overcome them. So we're delighted as a business and as a player in the industry that the government's moving forward on this process. It's great for consumers. It's great for the professionals that we work with every day. So we are really pleased it's happening and looking forward to supporting all of our customers and MHCLG in the next steps over the coming years to bringing this to life. Ben, from your point of view, anything to add on the overall that we've not said already before we sign off?
No, I don't think so. It's about time, in my opinion. We've now got to embrace it, work with government and industry, and just make the change because it's better for everybody, as you said.
Yeah, fantastic. So thank you very much to everyone for listening. Ben, thanks so much for your opinion. We could have made this a 5-hour podcast and talked in a lot more detail, but I'm sure there'll be more points that we talk about over the course of coming months and years as things start to get cemented in, and ultimately we can share some of the good news stories about the impact this is happening. Yeah, but before we go, just one last thing to say: thank you everyone for listening. You can find us on podcast platforms, Spotify, etc., and look forward to speaking to you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Landmark Talks Property. If you've enjoyed today's podcast, please hit subscribe. This podcast is for general purposes only. The views expressed are those of the hosts and guests and do not constitute professional advice.